WA Senator Linda Reynolds is suing former Liberal staffer Brittany Higgins for defamation. Now, it's the latest in a very long string of lawsuits that have been unfolding since Higgins first came out publicly with allegations against her former colleague Bruce Lehrmann. In today's deep dive, we're going to explain why a senator is suing her former staffer, what the case has heard so far, and what could happen next. Just a quick heads up that this deep dive does deal with matters including sexual violence. So if you're not in the right head frame to listen to this today, feel free to jump back on tomorrow. Now, Em, we have spoken many times about Brittany Higgins on this podcast before. Those episodes were mostly around, at first, the criminal case against Bruce Lehrmann that was later dropped, and then Lehrmann's defamation case against Network 10 that he lost. But today, we're talking about a different case, and that is because a new case has been brought by WA Senator Linda Reynolds. Linda Reynolds is suing her former staffer Brittany Higgins for defamation.
All right, so lots to unpack there, and I think off the bat, worth acknowledging that this is a really complicated one. So before we talk about this latest case, for the sake of all of us who might be feeling a little bit lost, can you run us through some of the background and how we got here?
Yeah, so in 2021, Brittany Higgins publicly alleged that she had been raped by, at that point, an unnamed co-worker in Parliament House. That co-worker turned out to be Bruce Lehrmann, and Lehrmann's criminal trial later failed due to juror misconduct. A retrial was eventually abandoned due to concerns about Higgins' mental health. So that was the criminal elements of the case. That was kind of put on hold, never really to be revisited. But then you might remember more recently that Lehrmann launched a defamation case in the federal court. So this was a civil case. He was claiming that he was identifiable in the initial coverage of Higgins' allegation. And so he was suggesting that he had been defamed.
And that was in a series of interviews with Higgins relating to the allegations.
It was. And that was a really long case. There were many twists and turns. I think we did, 2 or 3 episodes on it. Ultimately, the judge in that civil case found that it was more likely than not, and that's the threshold that had to be met, that Lehrmann raped Higgins, and therefore Lehrmann lost that case. You might remember Justice Lee, who was presiding over the case. He told Lehrmann that having escaped the lion's den, he made the mistake of going back for his hat. That's the case, just to jog people's memory. Lehrmann, who maintains his innocence, has since lodged an appeal. So criminal case, they weren't continuing. Civil case, there was an outcome, but Bruce Lehrmann is now appealing, and now we have another case.
Okay, so that civil defamation case wrapped in April, or for now, wrapped in April. And I think many of us might have presumed that that was going to be the last time this story would be in the headlines. As you mentioned, the criminal proceedings were abandoned. The defamation case seemed to have been wrapped up. But now this story has taken another turn. We have a third player entering the story at this point. Talk to me about Linda Reynolds and this case.
Yeah, so as I said at the top, Linda Reynolds is suing Brittany Higgins for defamation. And that's over some of Higgins' social media posts, and we'll go into what those posts are a little later. But before we do, I think that it's just a very important context to explain the relationship between the two women, because I had almost forgotten, but Linda Reynolds was the boss of Brittany Higgins when Higgins alleges that she was raped. Importantly, it was also in Linda Reynolds' office that Brittany Higgins alleges that the rape occurred.
After Brittany Higgins went public with those allegations, I remember there being criticism about Reynolds' handling of the alleged incident at the time, particularly Higgins criticising Reynolds in a few social media posts. Does that tie into these proceedings?
Yeah, exactly. So those are the social media posts that Reynolds is basing this defamation case on. So there are a number of posts, and I'm not going to kind of read them word for word, but essentially at a high level, in one of those posts, Higgins alleged that Reynolds continues to harass her through the media. In another one, which was an Instagram story, Higgins shared an article that had been written about Reynolds and added text on top of it on the Instagram story that said, instead of solving the problem, there are people who would prefer to just silence victims.
Okay, so with that in mind, Linda Reynolds is then arguing that these social media posts have tarnished her reputation. Is that the crux of it?
Exactly. That's the essence of what a defamation case is. And so this trial has now begun. It's before the WA Supreme Court at the moment. I will just add that there were attempts to settle it out of court, but all of those attempts failed. So it's made its way into court. After Lehrmann's failed defamation case in April, Higgins did issue a statement apologising to Reynolds. It said, "I hope we can resolve our differences with a better understanding of each other's experience." However, Reynolds didn't back down. She said at the time that she was continuing with a legal challenge to clear her name.
Also probably worth flagging here that Linda Reynolds is a federal senator. So in her capacity as Brittany Higgins' boss when Higgins was a Liberal staffer, we're talking about Linda Reynolds being a senator, but Reynolds has indicated she will not seek re-election next year. So she will be stepping away from politics in the near future.
Correct.
So this case has been going on for a little while now in the WA Supreme Court, as you mentioned. What have we heard from Linda Reynolds and her lawyers? What have they been arguing?
Yeah, well, there's been a lot, to be frank. And I think that sometimes in the reporting of not just this defamation case, but more broadly, as we said, the two other cases that have come before it, there has been a tendency to cover every single detail. And I think that that serves actually to confuse a bit. So I do just want to keep it really high level here. But essentially, Reynolds' case is predicated on this idea that she believes that Brittany Higgins and her now husband, David Shiraz, had a plan to publicly bring down the senator, bring down Linda Reynolds and the government that she was a part of. And she's saying that these social media posts really just built that narrative. Reynolds has expressed to the court that she, and I'm going to quote here, felt like one of those punching clowns at the fairground. You get punched down again, and you have to get up smiling. The court heard that Reynolds' health deteriorated quite dramatically after Brittany Higgins' allegations were first made public. She said that she was in pain from a heart condition, she wasn't sleeping, and that at one point she had to leave the Senate chamber as she was having a breakdown and sobbing uncontrollably. She was then hospitalised, and this was reported at the time. She then proceeded to take 3 weeks away from her job. She said that she has put her house on the line, everything she's worked for 40 years, putting everything on the line to be able to be here and tell the truth. So she is really here suggesting that the effect of Brittany Higgins' allegations about the way that she handled the situation had really, seeped into all parts of her life, not just her professional life. We had also heard from Reynolds' partner who testified in the case. He said, "The whole saga has had an immeasurable impact on Linda, on myself. It's affected every part of our life."
And so central to Reynolds' case then is this idea that the saga has impacted her physically, mentally, in every aspect of her life, and also this suggestion that Higgins and Shiraz had a calculated plan to bring her down, to damage her reputation.
Exactly.
And I saw headlines yesterday about former Prime Minister Scott Morrison and this case. What was that about?
Yeah, so yesterday, former PM Scott Morrison was asked to give evidence in this case. So he testified and he appeared via video link, and he told the court that he believed that he had witnessed the, quote, weaponising of the issue for political purposes to discredit Senator Reynolds, the government, and by extension, myself. Very strong language there from the former Prime Minister.
Who was, of course, leader at the time of the alleged rape.
Exactly. And this was something that really ended up defining his prime ministership and in some ways really determining the election. And so when he was asked about when he found out about Higgins' allegations, which again was this really big point in the process, he said to the court, and I'm quoting here, "As events transpired, Senator Reynolds chose not to tell me out of respect for the confidence that she had entered with Miss Higgins." He also told the court that Reynolds couldn't continue in her defence portfolio because of health concerns, and that those health concerns were related to the allegations and the fallout that followed. He said in reference to her cardiac condition, "For a period there, we were very concerned that this could be a fatal outcome for her." There he's referring to Senator Reynolds.
So we've spoken about Linda Reynolds and why she has brought this case against Brittany Higgins. But what about Higgins' defence? How has she responded and what have her legal team said?
Yeah, so Brittany Higgins' lawyers are partly relying on the truth defence, and the truth defence is essentially that you can't defame someone if the content of what you're saying is true. So essentially in this case, it will require lawyers to prove Higgins' comments were substantially true, including that Linda Reynolds failed to provide adequate support or harassed her.
And so we've seen an example of this kind of defence play out with the Lehrmann defamation case.
Exactly.
So that he claimed he had been defamed, but that Network 10 argued he hadn't been defamed because the comments in question were true, that they argued that he had raped Brittany Higgins and therefore aligning him with that offence was not defamatory.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's what Higgins' lawyers are in part trying to do here, suggesting that Linda Reynolds was not supportive, had continued to engage in a certain way with Higgins and her partner. But Brittany Higgins hasn't had the opportunity yet to give evidence. That is coming later this month. So we haven't heard directly from her in this case. One of her lawyers did say to the court, though, that the defamation proceedings are re-traumatising her. And there has been some conversation about whether a case like this should be pursued by a senator against her former staffer. And, you know, both women have come under significant financial stress as a result of this.
And we also know significant emotional distress based on Reynolds' hospitalisation, Higgins' own hospitalisation and her personal struggles that she has detailed. So it certainly doesn't feel like there are really any winners in this one. But we know that Brittany Higgins is expected to give evidence later this month. Proceedings are expected to continue to September. And then who knows how long a judgment could take before we get a final decision on this. Regardless, we will stay across it and keep you updated on the Daily Oz. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode of The Daily Oz. If this one brought up any issues for you, you can contact 1-800-RESPECT. We'll pop some links to further resources in our show notes. We'll be back with another episode tomorrow. Until then, have a great day.